Joyous celebrations everywhere greeted the officers. In this war, the United States had learned how to mobilize its vast strength into a major fighting force, and had learned, too, that the Atlantic Ocean was no longer a barrier to modern armies. The nations of Europe had seen at first hand the impressive potential power of the United States. The war had established the United States as a leader in the community of nations, a role from which it could never fully withdraw. Through Woodrow Wilson, the United States was also thrust into the moral leadership of the world. For Wilson had promised that this would be a war to end wars, a war to make the world safe for democracy. He himself, with a large staff, sailed for France for the peace conference at Versailles to try to make good these promises. Wilson arrived in France in December 1918. There he was besieged by the people, whose hearts he had stirred.
The hearts of men have never beaten so singularly in unison before. Men have never been so conscious of their brotherhood.
Before the peace conference, Wilson visited England and Italy. Everywhere he was hailed by vast crowds. He and the democracy of which he was president had become a symbol of hope to Europe's people. A groundswell rose among the people of the world as the leaders of the great powers gathered at Versailles for the peace conference. With his capacity to interpret the aspirations of people throughout the world, Wilson was the acknowledged leader of this conference. Its working chairman was the French statesman Clemenceau. The main responsibility for setting the terms of the peace was borne by the Council of Four. Here, next to Wilson, stands Clemenceau. Beside him is Orlando of Italy, and next to him the British war leader David Lloyd George. These three men had spent their lives dealing with the kinds of pressures and interests that had brought on the war, and they were not ready to accept the views of Woodrow Wilson, president of a nation with no territorial ambition.
We are here to see that the very foundations of this war are swept away. Those foundations were the private choice of a small coterie of civil rulers and military staff, the aggression of great powers upon the small, the holding together of empires of unwilling subjects by the duress of arms.
After months of discussion and controversy, as the world stood anxiously by, the Versailles Treaty was completed and signed by Germany in June 1919. It was not the peace without victory that Wilson had envisioned, but it contained the one provision Wilson thought most essential, the founding of a League of Nations to provide the machinery for international cooperation. But the United States Senate still had to ratify the treaty and the League. Wilson explained the League to his people this way.
My conception of the League of Nations is just this, that it shall operate as the organized moral force of men throughout the world, and that wherever wrong and aggression are planned or contemplated, this searching light of conscience will be turned upon them, and men everywhere will ask, what are the purposes you hold in your heart against the fortunes of the world?
Although a majority of the Senate voted for ratifying the Versailles Treaty, Wilson was unable to get the necessary two-thirds vote. The League of Nations met, but was repudiated by Wilson's own government. For many Americans were not yet ready to accept the position of world leadership which the war had thrust upon the United States. As Europe searched for a way to dig itself out of the ruins of the war, the United States returned to its traditional policy of isolation. But a new generation of American school children, as they studied the revised map of Europe, could no longer think of it as very remote from the United States.